I thought I had this video completely finished, edited, everything ready to go, but I've since decided I don't actually like the way that it started, so I'm recording a fresh intro for the rest of the video. Anytime the Z Fold line of phones gets talked about, there's one thing that comes up almost immediately from a fairly large group of people, and it is the width of the cover display. This is one of those things that you either really don't like, or for a lot of you, you actually do really like. And it's also one of these things where I feel like the conversation, I was going to say it's almost broken down, but I don't think that's even right, because it never really got started in the first place to then be later broken down. It's just a thing where people say, it's too skinny, I don't like it. And then other people say, I like that it's skinny, it's easier to hold with one hand. And then they also say something else. They say, it's not meant to be used for everything. It's meant to be used for quick, short bursts. If you want to do something with the phone that's going to be a bit more involved, you should just open it up. That is a very interesting concept to me. And it's something that I'd heard a bunch of times. And honestly, I'd always, when I heard it, I would just kind of dismiss it. And I'd say, well, I don't want that. I want a phone that's going to have a screen I can use for everything, and then a bigger screen I can use for different things. And because of that, because I'm not seeing past my own subjective preference, I'm being sort of dismissive to this other subjective preference. So in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of break those things down, but I'm also going to talk about Samsung's perspective, why they have continued to make a phone with this aspect ratio or something like this aspect ratio for the cover display of their device. Because the more I've thought about it, the more I've realized that those people who tell me the cover display is meant for quick things, you're meant to open the thing for other things, I think that from Samsung's perspective, they've been right all along. And the reality is, I've just been wanting to use a different phone with a different philosophy. We're both kind of right. So for this, we need to go all the way back to the beginning. This is the introductory trailer for the original Galaxy Z Fold, the Z Fold 1. And the reason that we're looking at this is because eventually in this trailer, they're going to show you the cover display on this device. It's very conveniently turned off because it's absolutely ridiculously small. There you go. You can see it right there. Look how small this cover display is on this device. Look at that chin up here, the forehead down here. That's it. It's only that area right there. And what does that tell you? When you look at the very first one, right? This is the one that started the Z Fold line, and that was the cover display that was on it. What it tells me is that Samsung was not building a phone that opens up into a tablet. No, they were building a tablet that happens to be able to fold and then has a cover display on it. That cover display was not meant to be used a lot. It was meant to be used for quick things. This is exactly the same thinking as the Z Flip. Okay, not exactly, but you know what I mean. You have the phone screen that you're going to use, but when it's closed, you needed some way to still interact with it. That's your cover display. Samsung doesn't expect you to use your cover display all the time. It's too small to do something like that, and that was exactly how it was meant to be for the original Z Fold. Again, let me just hammer this home. This was a tablet that folded, which had a cover display for quick tasks. You weren't meant to use this for much. You were meant to open it for almost every task. And because of that, Samsung chose to have an inner screen aspect ratio that was narrow enough that it would basically be a phone screen that was slightly larger. Of course, the logic there is that no app is going to be a problem. Every app is just going to load up and it's going to look basically like it does on your phone normally, just bigger. It's for compatibility. So if you're going to target that, if you're going to prioritize compatibility on the inner screen, look how narrow that was. You're going to then have an extraordinarily skinny cover display. I think that the primary feature that the Z Fold needed to have, according to Samsung, was it needed to have an internal display that was an aspect ratio similar to that of a phone, so that apps would be almost universally compatible. They targeted that. Yes, that made it a two-handed device because it was quite large. And when you cut that almost phone aspect ratio in half, you wind up with something that happens to be good to hold with one hand and also happens to be really, really skinny. Here's another quick reshoot. Once that Z Fold came out, there was a lot of criticism for that cover display. Even the people who thought the cover display was just for quick tasks thought that thing's a little bit too small to be all that useful. So Samsung had to make a move, and they had to make that cover display quite a bit bigger. So with the Z Fold 2, they did what they felt like they needed to do, and they made that cover display a whole lot bigger to make it more like a normal phone. But they did not sacrifice that inner screen aspect ratio. It stayed very much the same, taller than it is wide, good for regular phone applications. This is their philosophy. This is what they want this device to be. They've conceded a little bit that, hey, okay, yeah, it does need to be a bit more phone-like on the cover display, but that's not what they're trying to do. All these years later, we're on the 6th iteration of this device, they have still never fully lifted their foot out of that initial territory that they claimed with the original Z Fold. While every other OEM has been making phones that open into tablets, Samsung, they've tried to keep that foot in the tablet that folds space while still then increasing the size of that cover display to make it more phone-like. I hope that makes sense. They never fully abandoned that initial philosophical stake that they claimed on that idea to just say, okay, we'll make a normal screen for the cover display, and then we'll have it open, and then whatever aspect ratio that ends up being, probably relatively close to square, we'll just go with that and that'll be fine. No, they wanted it to stay skinnier. They wanted it to have the better compatibility with regular apps. And because of that, this, what we have on the Z Fold 6, is about as good as it's ever going to get until Samsung abandons that initial philosophy. And while I know a lot of you are getting kind of tired of this conversation, I want it to be a wider cover display. No, I like it to be narrow. I actually think this is extremely interesting if you get into why it is the way it is, because that's kind of the part of the conversation that gets left out. People just say all the time, I don't understand why Samsung doesn't just make the cover display wider. Well, I think this is why. I think that they have kind of put themselves into this box. This is what they're trying to do with this device. There are things that they don't want to sacrifice, and the inner display aspect ratio is something that apparently they feel very, very strongly about. And even though they've conceded a whole bunch of ground on that cover display, until they are willing to concede ground on the inner screen aspect ratio, that cover display simply cannot get any wider than it is now. Whether or not they need to concede that ground and change things, that's an even more interesting question, because we don't really know exactly where their sales numbers are. We don't really know how many people want that to change, how many people want it to stay the same. You would assume that Samsung does have that data, and there's some reason, there's something that's keeping them in this space. Now, I will say, they've gotten really close now, close enough that for a lot of people, they've blurred that line and it's not going to matter nearly as much anymore. But it's taken them years, 6 of them, to make it to where they are now with the Z Fold 6. Because again, that initial strategy, that initial principle that they had, that the internal display was the primary display and it needed to be compatible with pretty much every app, that has really held firm. So I would imagine most people probably don't think about this stuff nearly as deeply as I am in this video. Most people are just going to look at the phone and they're going to go, does this work for me? And they'll say yes, or they'll say no, and then they'll buy it, or they won't, and they're going to just move on. But personally, I think this is a really interesting conversation. What I want from you guys is let me know in the comments down below kind of where you stand on the cover display thing. Is it something that bothers you? Do you think they've arrived at a point where this is fine now and you don't really think about, how narrow it still is compared to other devices? But also, do you think I'm crazy about this? Do you think I'm just kind of making things up? Or do you think I've pieced together these clues in such a way that it makes sense and maybe that's actually what's been going on and that's why this sort of slow progression has been occurring? I might even run a poll and ask people if you would like to see a wider aspect ratio on these Z Fold devices. That might be interesting as well. If I do that, I'll put a link in the description or in a pinned comment down below. But until then, guys, I'll see you in the next one. And until next time, stay nerdy, my friends.